we're most privileged to have with us Professor Kwame Anthony Appiah. Professor Appiah is one of the distinguished scholars of our land, and he's here in Ghana to deliver the BBC Wreath Lecture. Professor Appiah, welcome to Joy News.
Good, I'm very glad to be here.
How does it feel to be home in Ghana?
Hot. I mean, it's just that I've just come from New York where it's beginning to get cool.
Right.
So, no, it's nice to be here. And my sister is here, so that's nice always to see my family.
Okay, all right. So, welcome once again. Now, Professor Appiah, your father, the late Joe Appiah, was an Asante royal, a politician, an MP, an ambassador who later became the president of the Ghana Bar Association. And your mother, Peggy Appiah, was daughter of Sir Stafford Cripps, the former Britain Chancellor of the Exchequer, who was from a long line of distinguished aristocrats. He helped negotiate the terms of India's independence from British rule. How was growing up like as somebody from an elite family yet very culturally diverse?
Well, you know, everybody grows up in a family and their family seems perfectly normal to them. My family didn't seem very peculiar to me. We knew that other people thought we were peculiar, but you know, it was a normal family life. We grew up with our parents, and my grandfather was dead by the time that my parents got married, but we did know his widow, my grandmother, very well. She came to Ghana often, and then we visited her in England as well. So we were raised to think of ourselves as very privileged, and therefore as having a duty to do things in the world in return, as it were, for our privileges. So we were raised. My father's, you know, as you mentioned, my father served Ghana in various ways, but he would have told us that we wherever we lived, we had to figure out how to be good citizens of that place and make contributions.
Professor Appiah, who do you look up to while growing up? Who was your role model?
Well, I mean, I admired my father a lot. He was often very busy. If you're a member of Parliament, when there was a Parliament, you're in Accra a lot. So he was away a lot. And then, you know, sometimes he would be, later on, he was in New York at the UN or in India doing something diplomatic or something. But I would say he took more interest in us than would have been normal for an Asante father in his father's generation, because, as you know, the Asante are matrilineal, and the normal adult male for you to hang around with would have been your mother's brother, not your mother's husband.
Your uncle.
Your wafa.
Your wafa.
and my wafa lived in England. So we had. So I did admire my father very much. He always struck me as someone who was pretty principled, and he also loved Ghana, and he loved Asante too. And he thought that was perfectly consistent, that he didn't have to choose between Asante and Ghana, he could love them both. Right. And he was also, I should say, a very devoted Pan-Africanist. He was at the 1945 Pan-African Congress in Manchester, where Dr. Du Bois was, and he represented the West African Students' Union there. And he went to a number of other Pan-African Congresses later on, and he was a devout believer in the development, first of the Organization of African Unity, and then eventually of the African Union.
So, Professor Appiah, growing up, did you set out to be a philosopher? Or, like you said, you admired your father, so you wanted to be a lawyer like him, or pursue some other career?
You know, it's a very weird thing. I have three sisters who grew up with me, and none of us wanted to be a lawyer, even though we lived in the house of a lawyer, and his office was in our house, and my mother ran his office, and his clients came, you know, sat on the veranda and brought sheep or turkeys or whatever.
This is Kumasi.
This is in Kumasi, in Mbum, just sort of below Asante New Town. And so it was, I don't know why. Anyway, none of us wanted to be a lawyer, and I should say that's a little bit even more surprising since my mother's father was a lawyer too, and so was his father, and so was his father. So my usual explanation is that we decided that 5 generations of lawyers was enough. But the truth is, it never occurred to me to be a lawyer, partly because I decided when I was very young that I wanted to be a doctor.
Okay.
And so if you tell people from the age of 8 that you want to be a doctor, people don't say, why don't you want to be a lawyer? They say, oh, that's okay, it's fine to be a doctor. So, and I went all the way through my education until university thinking I was going to be a doctor, and I studied medical sciences at Cambridge for my first year of university, which was a disaster. I hated it. So I switched to philosophy because I liked it. So I absolutely had not planned to do that. And indeed, when I shifted from medicine to philosophy, I was just thinking, well, I'll do my undergraduate degree in philosophy, and then I'll, like most people who do an undergraduate degree in philosophy, I'll do something else, because you know, philosophy isn't a preparation for much of for any particular career except philosophy. But I really enjoyed it as an undergraduate.
It wasn't difficult?
It was only, I mean, I suppose it was difficult, but I found it easier than everybody else around me. So
of course, you ended up, making a first class.
So I got a very good degree. But I think the reason I did better than other people was because I'd been doing it longer than other people. So I started reading philosophy in high school with friends because I found it interesting, and so I cheated basically. I was better prepared than the others, but I did enjoy it and I did well. And so when I graduated, I packed up my books and I went home to Kumasi. And after a month or two, my parents said, "So, you have a degree, what are you going to do with your life?" And my wise mother said, "You have a Cambridge philosophy degree, maybe you should go to Legon and ask them if they'll let you be a teaching assistant." So that's what I did. I was a teaching assistant. My first job, I was a teaching assistant at Legon. And after maybe a month or two into that, I thought, I want to be a professor. I like this. But I hadn't done it for that reason. I just needed to make a living doing something. But I've sort of fell in love with it. And at that point, it was a very interesting place. Kwesi Wirdu was the head of the department, a very brilliant Ghanaian philosopher. Kwame Jechi was there. Very, very interesting place.
Right, so Professor Appiah, your father, the late Joe Appiah, who was a student of Roman classics, considered naming you after Socrates, and your mother opposed it. Now, Stanford University describes you as our postmodern Socrates. How do you feel about that?
Well, mostly what I feel is embarrassed. I mean, Socrates, he's the founder of the Western philosophical tradition in many ways. He's the last oral figure. Plato wrote down Socrates' conversations, but Socrates himself didn't write anything. And of course, all philosophy begins out of oral tradition and then gets written down later. But I think I'm probably less aggressive than Socrates. I mean, Socrates was rather inclined to pummel people with his arguments. I hope I can be more gentle. And I've never understood why anyone thinks I'm postmodern. I think of myself as just a contemporary philosopher. Postmodern has this sense of being very concerned with difficult questions in areas of the subject that I'm not actually very interested in. So, I'm sorry that Stanford University has misrepresented me in that way.
Now, Professor, obviously you're a world-famous philosopher. In 2009, Forbes magazine named you as one of the 7 most powerful philosophers, and in 2010, Foreign Policy magazine in the US also named you amongst 100 topmost philosophers in the world. How has your culturally diverse background shaped your thinking and influenced what you do now?
It's very hard to answer a question like that because, all of us come from where we are, and I come from a culturally diverse background, so that's normal for me.
Right.
But it must have had a big impact, if you just think about it, because for one thing, I've written a fair amount of stuff that is just about the question of identity, what it is to be a person in the modern world with a race and a gender and a religion and a nationality and a sexual orientation, and how those things all come together to make a person. And in my own life, I have perhaps a little bit more of that complexity in that than some people. In the first of the Ruth lectures, I pointed out that very often in London, taxi drivers assume that I'm Indian, because I sort of look vaguely Indian. And then when I tell them I don't know Hindi, they usually treat me as if I must just be lying, that I'm just trying to avoid talking to them in Hindi. So I think that I have, have materials in my own life to draw on. That's useful in philosophy to have, but I don't think that anything I say is something that couldn't have been said by somebody with a different background. It's just that certain things are more easy for me to think about because of my background, and other things maybe harder for me to think about. I mean, I think, I'm kind of inclined to celebrate the world of mixture that is produced in a place like Accra, which is a cosmopolitan city with people from lots of places. Of course, if you're someone who is very settled in a village or a small town somewhere, you might find that scary. You might think, and especially if people from somewhere else were to show up in your small town and start changing your small town. Maybe your small town doesn't yet have a mosque, and then somebody arrives with a mosque, and then it doesn't have any Catholics, and then the Catholics arrive and they build a cathedral, and you're thinking, well, I liked this place before, I'm not sure I like the new world. So, whereas I've always lived in places which are like Kumasi, which has had mosques and churches since long before my grandfather was born, and so there are things that I have to sort of learn to think about because I haven't had certain experiences.
Now, Prof, your paternal grandfather was one of the people who helped establish the Methodist Church in Kumasi, and I understand you're fond of John and Charles Wesley.
Yes.
And you also enjoy Methodist hymns.
Yes.
How important is faith to you?
Not very. I'm very interested in religion. The first week lecture was about religion.
Right.
I think it's something that anybody who's trying to understand the modern world has to take account of. I think a lot of people misunderstand the religious lives of other people. They, in particular, I think they're inclined to think that that a religious tradition is more restrictive than I think most religious traditions actually are. But my own way of thinking about the universe is not very theological, and so I wouldn't say that faith matters. Faith, that is belief, is very important to me. On the other hand, I do think that there are other aspects of religion that are important to me. There are certain services that I value because of what they mean, and that's not faith, that's practice, that's religious practice. And I think one of the arguments of my first lecture was that it's really important to recognize the central role of the things people do in religion as opposed to the things they think. Going to church together, singing together, being together, building hospitals together. These are things that people do as religious communities. And they're really, really important. And they don't have much to do with faith in the sense of belief. You can join in those activities and have different beliefs from the other people in your community. The Unitarian Church in the United States recognizes that some of its members are going to be atheists. That's fine with them, because they are the things they do together are moral and public-spirited and communal, and you don't have to believe in God to participate in those things. So that's just a fact about Unitarians. Many modern Jews are not theological. Many modern Jewish communities, they don't care what you believe, whether you believe in God. They want you to study the Torah, the books of Moses. They want you to come to services. They want you to do good works in the community, but they don't ask you, by the way, do you believe in God? They don't care about that. So, religions are different. Modern evangelical Christianity is, of course, very focused on questions of faith. That's one kind of religion, but there are other kinds of religion in which faith is, I think, less important.
Okay, all right. Prof, let's talk about leadership and governance in Africa for a moment. Now, many academics have identified several causes of Africa's underdevelopment. Some have cited poor leadership. Others have cited the fact that the educated elites have abdicated their responsibility. What's your assessment of some of the causes of Africa's underdevelopment?
Well, in a way, the question about development, I think, is not why certain forms of development haven't occurred here and in some other places in the world, but why they did occur in the places that they did. We've had, even when I was a child, even in the 1950s, Ghana was about as developed as South Korea, if you looked at the statistics. Right. Similar population, similar income, and so on. And now South Korea is an advanced industrial economy. They did that in a very particular way, and one thing they didn't do was start with a very democratic system. They started with a very top-down system. We began with democracy, and that may have been, one of the things that made a difference. I think democracy is a good idea, so I don't regret that. But I do think that there are sort of comparisons to be made between where we are now and where other countries that were the same place as us 50 years ago are. And I can't say that I think that it's obvious what the answer is. Certainly, we've had some very strong leaders. We've had some Nkrumah was a strong, powerful leader. He was a leader with ideas about how to develop the country. He wasn't just someone who wanted to advance his own interests. He wasn't at all self-centered in that sense. He was trying to advance the country, and he used, in order to develop the country, he used a model of development that was recommended by liberal development economists like Sir Arthur Lewis, who was the author of the first Ghanaian development plan and went on to get the Nobel Prize for economics. Okay. And that model was that you took the surplus from agriculture, because cocoa was doing well, and you used it to industrialize. That didn't go very well here. One reason is that the industrial sector was developed as parastatals. It was developed in a way that left lots of opportunities for sort of corruption and for money to be siphoned off without actually doing things that were productive. And it might have been better to have a more capitalist picture of how to do industrial development. So there are lots of things you can argue about in terms of policy in the particular case of Ghana about what was right. And by the way, I think that was one of the things that my father and the UP, the United Party, disagreed with Nkrumah about, was exactly what the balance should be between private and public control of the economy. But so I don't think we've had especially bad leaders in Ghana by world standards. So I don't think I would want to put the blame there. We also have had, from a very long time, since well before independence, a relatively educated country, and we continue to be a relatively high literacy country with a lot of very highly educated people. You just go to the UN, you've got Kofi Annan, you've got all these Ghanaians all over the place in the world. They're produced by a country that has a good education system. It may be people complain about the education system today and they say it isn't as good as it was, but the fact is there are lots of very educated Ghanaians being produced all the time. So I think that I don't have a diagnosis of that would allow you to pull a few switches and say, if we did these 5 things, we'd develop faster. Our economy has done pretty well until relatively recently, over the last decade or two. So I think it shows that we can do well. I gather people don't think the economy is going very well at the moment. I have no idea why that is. I'm not an economist.
Okay. Right. Prof, you mentioned Nkrumah as one of the good leaders we've had, and the fact that he was visionary, he was purposeful, he knew what he was about. What's your definition of who a good leader is?
Well, I think if you're talking about political leadership, and I think it's different in different domains.
Right.
So leadership in corporations, I think, is different from leadership in countries. I would say the hardest task for a leader is to remain open to the possibility that you're wrong. The effect of having power is that you accumulate people around you who want to stay near to power, and so they don't tell you what they think, they tell you what you want to hear. And over again, you watch politicians who are quite successful to begin with and who are genuinely open and listening and responsive to the thoughts and the needs of the people and to the advice that they're getting, become more and more closed and less interested in what anybody else thinks. That happened to Nkrumah. Nkrumah stopped hearing the voices of ordinary Ghanaians because the people around him, who my father used to refer to as the gaping sycophants, their mouths wide open, telling him how wonderful he was, he lost track of what was actually going on in the country. He was genuinely surprised when the people celebrated at the coup, I think. He didn't know that there were that many people who would be happy to see him go. So I'd say, a large part of political leadership is actually being able to listen. It's not about having something that you want to do that you're going to impose on people.
Okay.
It's trying to figure out what you can make work by knowing what people are willing to do and what they aren't willing to do. Of course, you have to have ideas and you have to propose them, but in the end, you won't be able to do anything unless you can bring people along. And in order to bring people along, you have to know what they're thinking. You have to be able to get a sense of what people are thinking and feeling. And we've had other leaders, I think, who definitely had that capacity. This will be an unpopular thing to say, no, but I think President Rawlings had some of that when he was in power. And I say that even though he was one of the many people who locked my father up over the years. So I think that's an important, but there is this magical thing as well, what Weber, the great social scientist, called charisma. Some people have this capacity to communicate excitement through the camera or through a large crowd, and sometimes people need to be excited in order to do difficult things. Ghanaian development is difficult, and we have to just make hard choices about what we're going to do. To have the sense that this person leading the thing cares about everybody, is not selfish and self-interested, but also has a strong, attractive personality. That's a thing, and that's not something you can. I don't think it's something you learn. You've either got it or you haven't got it.
All right, Prof, now your fame and respect are based on critical thinking. Do you find, monitoring development in Ghana and Africa, that our leaders place much value on critical thinking in trying to find solutions for our problems on the continent?
It's a very hard thing for an intellectual to figure out how to be useful to a politician, because the reason I'm willing to spend all that time on my own with the books and the typewriter is because I enjoy trying to understand things much more than I enjoy trying to do anything. An intellectual is someone who's interested in understanding things, and a politician has to be interested in getting something done. And those can produce conflict, because the person who wants to understand something is busy trying to get it right, and the politician is saying, I'm sorry, but the budget has to be out tomorrow, and we can't have an argument in the cabinet about whether we're Keynesians or neo-Keynesians or whatever. We have to decide what kind of budget we're going to have, and that's not helping. I think it's reasonable for politicians to be skeptical that certain kinds of intellectuals will be much use to them, not because they aren't good intellectuals, but because they don't have the capacity to focus down on the practical question of, what should we do, what is to be done. The kind of criticism that I think is underappreciated by political leaders everywhere, but it's especially striking, I think, in Africa, is not really the critical thinking of intellectuals. It's the critical thinking of a kind of public that notices that what you're doing isn't working and wants you to know that they've noticed, right? They want to say, Mr. President, that's not working. You keep talking about, our energy policy, but my lights, doomso, my lights are gone. Or Mr. President, you keep talking about, the improving the water supply, but as far as I can tell, in my town, the water, and that's what I meant by listening. I mean, I think that when somebody does that to you, if you're a president, they're doing you a favor. You shouldn't think of that as negative, or you shouldn't try and shut them up. They're giving you a really useful piece of information that you have to, two pieces of information. One is something is wrong, but the other is they care about it, right? There are lots of things that are wrong, nobody's complaining about them, because they recognize that it's complicated and that you can't do everything at once. You need to know what the things are that people are really thinking about. And that kind of criticism, which comes through good media, through journalism, through criticism by scholars in the universities, through criticism by outsiders, all of that I think is really useful, and you need to learn how to use it, to put it good use. And the fact is that, in my view, is that it's almost never possible for someone to keep that openness if they've been in power for too long. This happened to Mrs. Thatcher. I didn't happen to like her policies on day one, but by the end she wasn't listening in England. She wasn't listening, and so she became less effective even by her own standards. And the same is true of her Labour Party successors. Particularly Mr. Blair. So you can be around too long, because this openness and this willingness to accept criticism is really hard to do. But it's absolutely crucial. It's how you sustain legitimacy. It's how you persuade people that they ought to accept your decisions. It's because they know that you know what they want and what they think. You may tell them they can't have it. That's fine. But as long as you know what they want, and as long as you tell them why they can't have it, you can be legitimate even in very difficult circumstances. But if you're not listening, if the reason you aren't getting something isn't that the president's thought about it, the government has thought about it and decided not to give it to you, it's just they didn't think about it. They didn't know that's what you... Why would you want a government like that? Why would you support a government that doesn't even know what you want?
All right. Prof, let's talk about your work. You wrote an article titled Cosmopolitan Patriots. And I quote, you said, in a world of cosmopolitan patriots, people would accept the citizens' responsibility to nurture the culture and politics of their homes. Question, you've lived in the US for some time. In what ways has the American society allowed you to nurture the politics and culture of that society?
Good. So, my father wanted us, he didn't tell us where we should live, and so he has 4 children who don't live in Ghana. But he did tell us that wherever we lived, we should try to be good citizens. And so I've tried to be a good citizen in the way in which someone with my training and my profession can be. So I'm not a politician. As I just explained, I think that some of the temperament, the intellectual temperament of an intellectual makes you a bad politician. You're too worried about getting the theory right and not worried enough about getting the practice right. And practice in politics is the art of the possible. So what do I do? Well, I think the contribution of people like me is to create debate in our culture in the United States about the sorts of questions that I know something about, that will inform the way citizens think about it, and also the way in which the authorities, whether they're in the legal system or in the government, as members of the executive, the way they think about it. So I've written a fair amount in public places, the New York Review of Books or the New York Times, over the years, about things that I thought I knew something about, where I was making, I thought, a contribution to the thinking of America about some question. I've written a lot about race in America, and the President of the United States apparently thinks that what I've written is helpful because he gave me a medal for my contributions.
Yeah.
So I've tried to be helpful in that way. I think that philosophers, if you want something from philosophers, you shouldn't ask them to tell you what to do or even what to think. But you can ask us to help you think for yourself. And the way we can help you think for yourself is by putting out there ideas that you can use, like identity, that you can use for living your life and for doing your politics. And that's what I try to do. I try to write things when I write for philosophers, and then I'm just writing for philosophers. But when I'm writing for the world, as it were, I'm trying to give people tools for thinking that I think stimulate conversation and maybe get people to see possibilities that they hadn't seen before, or to see maybe that they've been trapped by a certain picture which has led them to think that they have to go this way, and maybe they don't have to go that way, maybe they could go another way, and then they have to decide which way they want to go, but at least I've shown them that there are two ways when they only thought there was one. So I wouldn't take much notice of what I say about which way you should go, but I hope I can help you see that you have two ways or three ways in a context where everybody's assuming there's only one way.
So in what ways do you think that Ghana's government can tap talented Ghanaians and influential people, scholars like that?
Well, I think there are questions about the management of the economy and the legal system where we have access to Ghanaians who are very distinguished economists and very distinguished legal theorists and lawyers, where it doesn't matter where they're living, their interest in Ghana because they come from Ghana will mean that if you ask them to come and help, they probably will. And I would have thought that that's one perfectly natural thing to ask Ghanaians, whether they're here or outside, who are highly trained, to do. I have to say that I've tried over the years to collaborate in that sort of way at various levels, and my one feeling is that I didn't always get the collaboration from the civil service that I would have liked to have, and that I'm not an expert on how to make civil servants do things or how to help them to do things, and so I sort of backed off from various things where I thought if I had found a counterpart in the civil service, not so much a politician, but just a senior administrator who could see what I was, who could understand what I was proposing and see that it was a good idea and execute it. Because I'm not a manager, I don't know how to execute things. I have some ideas, some good ideas, and some of them have been tried out in other places successfully, so I know they work, or they can work. But I didn't feel that I got... and I think some people are discouraged in that way. They offer help. I think the help we were offering, we offered in a modest spirit. We weren't telling them that we were going to solve the world's problems. We thought we had an idea that would be useful, and it didn't turn out that we could get collaboration. So one thing a government can try to figure out, is whether, when it does have people who want to help, it can make sure that their counterparts in the government structures are genuinely willing to help them, and can see, you have to persuade them that it's important to help the people who want to come and help from outside. I have no stakes in any of this. I mean, I want Ghana to do well, but none of these are things where it's going to cost me money to do these things. I'm not interested in trying to make money out of Ghana, but I do think there are things you could do that would help, and it's a bit frustrating that your counterparts, the people who are supposed to help you, often don't.
Prof, one of your books, In My Father's House, a bestseller, you said it was about exploring the role of African and African American intellectuals in shaping contemporary African cultural life. So my question, what for you is the most important contribution of these intellectuals in shaping modern African cultural life?
I continue to think, that book was 25 years ago, but I continue to think, and Africa has changed a lot in those 25 years, and in good ways in many places. Right. So there's more democracy in Africa than there was 25 years ago. It's a terrific thing. So, I'd say that for better or worse, and sometimes for worse, the idea that Africa was a continent that should come together to try and solve its political problems, which is the Pan-African idea, that idea was invented in the New World. It was invented by African people in the Afro-Caribbeans. It was invented by people like Dr. Du Bois, who was an African-American from North America. It was invented by people like Sylvester Williams from Jamaica. It was invented by people like George Padmore, another West Indian. It was only after the Second World War, really, that Africans took hold of the Pan-African movement. So I mentioned, I think, that my father was at the 1945 Pan-African Congress in Manchester. That was really the one where Dr. Du Bois was. That was really the one where the leadership moved from the diaspora into Africa, and in the generations afterwards, as the Kaundas, the Kenyatas, the Nyereres, the Nkrumahs, took over.
Okay.
But that means that for the first 50 years of its life, Pan-Africanism was fundamentally something being developed by black people outside Africa. And as I say, for better or worse, I mean, there are features of the way Pan-Africanism thinks about African unity that I worry about. I think it can easily get racialized in a way that I think is not very helpful. But the idea that the continent should try to sort of act together is a perfectly reasonable political idea. And I do think the African Union, people often say that the African Union doesn't do anything, but that's not true. The African Union's done lots of things. It hasn't done some things that everybody would like it to do. We still have a problem in Central Africa, right, and nobody's been able to figure out how to solve that problem. But it's a really hard problem. And it's not too surprising that it hasn't been solved like that. So I think that's one of the big legacies, is just the idea that, and because it came the way it did, because Pan-Africanism came the way it did, it connects people in Africa to a wide diaspora of people of African descent in Europe, in North America, in the Caribbean, and in Latin America, which is another resource for Africa. I mean, it's starting just with the simple fact that on the plane that I came from New York on, there were African Americans who were doing heritage tourism, coming to the United States. They bring their enthusiasm, they bring their dollars, they make friends, they keep coming and going, sometimes they even build houses here. That's also something that I think gives us friends The United States foreign policy in the United States is often shaped by Americans who identify with somewhere else, whether it's Armenians who identify with Armenia, or Jews who identify with Israel, or Irish people in America who identify with Ireland. And there's a significant part of American foreign policy is shaped by the fact that many black Americans care in the same way about Africa that Irish Americans care about Ireland and Jewish Americans care about Israel. Now, often what happens in those circumstances is that these people who care about a place, whether they're Irish or Jewish or black, don't know too much about it, and so they get stuff wrong. They try to help, and they aren't helpful because they've got the wrong ideas. But still, they're a resource, and keeping in touch with them and helping them to understand more accurately what the needs are that they can help with, is part of a reasonable foreign policy aim for a country like Ghana.
Prof, let's talk about U.S.-Africa relations and still staying on the subject of African Americans. Initially, they were called Negroes, and then they were called Afro-Americans. Now, do you think this sequence of description has changed the status of African Americans for the good?
The most important thing about the change of names is that for the first time, African Americans were being named by a term that they or their leaders had chosen. And that was a reflection of a change in America, right? It wasn't just the cause of it. It was because, after the Civil Rights Movement, a lot of Americans recognized the badness of what had gone on since the American founding in terms of slavery, and then Jim Crow and racial segregation and the American apartheid system and so on. And so, as a sign of respect to black people, they said, "We've been calling you this, what do you want to be called?" and people thought about it, and actually I think Jesse Jackson, probably more than anybody else, pushed for African American, and people said, all right, if a black, we'll call you African American because a black leader has said we should call you African American. So that was good. That was a sort of, that was a sign of good movement, I think. It also implied a parallelism between the relationship between African Americans in Africa and the relationship between Irish Americans in Ireland and so on. It suggested that a more normal, that African Americans fitted into a sort of normal pattern where they had a double identity, American and something else. That I think can be misleading because it makes a big difference that African Americans lived through slavery and Jim Crow and racial second-class citizenship, and though early Irish immigrants did have a horrible time and were treated as essentially as racial inferiors, they didn't go through it for so long, and they certainly don't suffer from it now. So that parallelism can be exaggerated in its significance. But I do think that one of the reasons why it's possible to get the United States to, for example, change the way it handles customs, trade duties, tariffs for Africa in the way that they were changed under the Bush administration, the second Bush administration. That sort of thing depends upon African Americans going to the Congress and saying, this is what we want you to do for Africa.
Okay.
And, you know, I happen to think that those were good proposals, that they created opportunity for African businesses, which wasn't there before, which I think is a good thing. So there's a way in which having a significant African American population can be a resource for African states, because they care about Africa in a way that of course some white Americans care about Africa too, especially people who've been here as in the Peace Corps and that kind of thing. But still, there's a kind of solid base of support for in the United States for policy towards Africa that comes from African Americans. And a sensible government in Ghana is going to take advantage of that and be in dialogue with African American leadership in order to see what can be done together.
Okay. Okay. Prof, beyond the nomenclature, do you think discrimination against the black community in the US will ever end? Recently, we've seen several incidents of police shooting unarmed blacks. Do you think this disturbing trend will ever come to an end?
I'd have to be a prophet to know the answer to that question. Here's what I can tell you without being a prophet. It's not going to stop soon. I mean, I don't see, because it's the result of things that are baked into American social life. I believe that there's a willingness among a decent proportion of all Americans. 70% of Americans now answer polling questions saying there's a problem about the way blacks are treated. So there's a willingness to accept that there are things that need to be done. That's good. But it remains the case that deep down in the consciousness of every American, black or white, is a sense of a racial system which affects how people respond to each other at the most unconscious level. It's not just about what goes on in the front of people's minds, it's in the back of their minds. And it's one of the reasons that explains why black and white people have such different experiences of the police. And it's not really the fault of the police, it's a cultural thing. The police are just the sharp end of it. But I don't think one should blame them individually. It's a systemic problem, and it needs a systemic...
So what can be done to stop this?
Well, some of what, much has been done. It is many things are way better than they used to be, after all. And I think that continuing to be aware of the problem and looking to improve police training, for example, which I think it makes a difference. In some places they have these problems, in other places they don't, and one of the differences is whether the police are trained properly to think about these things in the right way. So there are just lots of things to do. If you want an example of a really unhelpful thing, I think it's almost everything that Donald Trump has said about this matter, which has been profoundly counterproductive, has encouraged, rather than discouraging racism, it's kind of brought racism out of the woodwork and encouraged it. And whether or not he's personally racist, I have no idea, but that isn't the problem. The problem is that he's encouraging it for his own political ends. And that's bad. So I would say one thing we could very usefully do right now is to get Donald Trump to shut up. And maybe the American people will do that when they don't vote him into the presidency. If they do vote him into the presidency, then we will go through a difficult period in many things, but in particular in race relations.
Prof, let's talk about President Barack Obama's presidency. What has been the one significant benefit to the African continent?
To the African continent? Well, I think it's been good to have a president who knows something about Africa, and who will listen when somebody comes and says, here's an African problem that we ought to do something about. But I can't say that I think the achievements are very substantial to list. Some of the things that he has done are continuations of things that went on under the Bush administration, which were good in relation to support for anti-AIDS work, in relation to continuing to develop the opportunities for African businesses to partner with American businesses and so on. He's done all that. But the trouble is that given the way American politics works, it's very important for his survival with the support of the population that he doesn't look like he's too focused on Africa because then they'll say, his enemies will say, look, we elected a black president and all he cares about is Africa. So he has to be careful how much attention he plays. But he's paid serious attention to a lot of African issues, and he has appointed good people to the positions in the US government that have to do with Africa, I think. And he's well-intentioned, and that makes a big difference, because if people know that the president is positively inclined, they do things that he doesn't have to tell them to do. They do things because they know the president will want them done, and that he would be upset to discover that they haven't done them. So it sets a tone, I think. And that's one thing a president can do.
Okay.
For better or worse. I mean, as I say, if Donald Trump were to become president, the tone would be definitely worse.
Well, finally, you're delivering the prestigious BBC lecture on mistaken identities. Why this topic, and why should anybody pay attention?
Because the world would remain much better if people made fewer mistakes about identities, I think. I'm going to talk about race as a form of identity in here. And as in all the lectures, I'm going to talk about it in part by telling stories about how race has worked for various people. I'm not going to preempt my talk by telling you which stories I'm going to tell. But look, we've talked about problems of ethnic and tribal difficulties in the world. We've talked about, we haven't talked much about, but one could talk about challenges of gender, and the row between Britain and some African countries about Britain's concerns about the treatment of gay people in Africa and so on. I mean, all of these have to do with identity, and getting clear about identity is exactly the sort of thing that I think, as I said before, a philosopher can usefully do. I can't tell you what to think about these things, but I can tell you that this is a muddle. This is not a good way to think about it. Or you think there's only one option here, but actually there's many options. And then people have to decide how they want to live and how they want to think. So you just look around the world today, you see problems of identity, whether they're interethnic problems in many parts of the world, whether they are interreligious problems in a country like India, where there are tensions between Muslims and Hindus, whether they are, as I say, the problems around gender, which is obviously a powerful form of identity that is important in every country. Rows about the role of women are a perpetual feature of modern politics, and the relative positions of men and women. Again, our presidential campaign in the United States, which is between a man and a woman, has raised questions about how men treat women in particular, very much to the popular consciousness, and they've become central to the political campaign. So I think there are many ways in which issues of identity are just sitting there in our lives, making a difference, and a little bit of clarity about them is a useful thing.
Prof, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
And to you.
We wish you all the best.
Terrific.
Right, God bless.